In my world there is music and good vibes and laughter and lovers, adventure and friendship. We know who we are.
Hello and welcome everybody. Be the Wellness Podcast. Podcast day.
There's a new song. Over. I wrote it about podcasting.
Yeah?
Yes.
How's it go?
Sweet dreams are made of podcasting.
Oh, boy.
It's still a work in progress.
It's still a work in progress. Yeah. So something that the more attentive of you have probably noticed is that we're recording a lot more podcasts these days. And just because of the way our schedule works, we do them on Mondays.
Right.
And so we've done a triple header is the biggest that we've gone so far.
Yes.
And it's like it starts to make you a little rummy after a while. I mean, it's really good, but like after a period of time, you're like things get a little weird. So
you just start drooling and hoping that the guest can create a question out of it.
Right. But you guys don't listen to them 3 in a row like this, right? So
maybe
like
they do.
Every Sunday it's like, oh, it's a fresh podcast. But what you may not realize is what we just recorded may have been like 3 podcasts deep and however many takes of getting it right. So when you're like, geez, what's wrong with these guys today?
Are you trying to make, like you're trying to give them a context for the song?
Yes. Yes, exactly.
For why the song wasn't that good?
Yeah.
I said it's a work in progress.
Right. Yes.
Okay, yeah, got it.
So, right. So fun with podcasts.
Fun with podcasting. And if you are enjoying the podcast and you like hearing us sing new songs and create new conversations with interesting guests, please leave us a 5-star review on iTunes or wherever you listen. But iTunes is the one we're most familiar with. And you can write us a nice review, throw us some 5 stars. You know, you can even leave us your Instagram handle so we can start stalking you. It's up to you. I mean, the sky is the limit.
Yeah, it's true. The virtual high five goes a long way.
It really does.
And with iTunes, it's super easy now because you can just go on your mobile device or potentially on the desktop. I haven't done that in a while.
Potentially.
And you go into the actual view, like the description of the episode. And when you scroll down to the bottom, there's a spot you can do it.
It's super easy.
So it's super cool. Yeah, you used to be like 15 pages deep of clicking around to find it, and they've solved that problem.
They have, yes, absolutely. So we have an awesome guest today, Laura Schoenfeld from lauraschoenfeldrd.com. And she is an RD. And, you know, when she first reached out to me, she actually reached out because we both were nominated for some Best of Paleo categories. And I started reading through some of the information on her website. And the thing that stood out to me, and one of the reasons I really wanted to get her on the show, is that she talks a lot about the importance of actually eating enough food, getting women over their fear of eating food, getting some better context for how much food is enough. And, you know, we have our Build Your Plate challenge, and we're always talking to clients about this exact thing, especially in the realm of intermittent fasting and all of, keto and all of these things where it's really easy to get underfueled. This is a really important topic, and a lot of things get thrown off if you're consistently underfueled. 100%.
Yeah, it's like all of the various macros start to not matter nearly as much if there just aren't enough calories. And it really is, like Vanessa was saying, it's a slippery slope, and it's an easy way to get there when you're eating a high fat diet, high protein, high fat diet that's, pretty satiating. So pretty soon you're like, I'm just not really that hungry. And then your resting metabolic rate drops, and then you aren't that hungry, and you just start chasing this thing down. And you're like, I don't really understand why none of my things are working. I'm eating 1,000 calories a day, but I'm just not hungry.
Right, exactly.
And you're like, well, okay.
And you hear this time and time again, especially folks who go paleo, and they're like, it's great. I'm never hungry. I feel fine. And there is that really like nuanced balance between, okay, great, you're never hungry, but if you aren't ever hungry, it's really easy to undereat. And so this is really great information. And in fact, she has a program that can help you get back on track with your eating and kind of making sure that you're getting enough calories and kind of quantifying the amount of food that you're eating. So make sure you can check it out in the show notes. It's a really easy way to actually get on track. It's a quick program. I think it's 14 days, I believe. And, just something to check in. If you have a lot of different, if there's different things going on that are kind of of unexplainables and you can't quite figure out why things aren't quite jiving, even though, in black and white, you're really eating clean and it looks like you're doing a great job at your diet and your nutrition. That might be something to just examine and make sure is on track.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, we see it a ton when, especially with personal coaching clients and stuff, and people come in and they're like, okay, and I give them how much food they're eating. They're like, oh my God, this is so much food. And you're like, well, all right, here, it's not that much food. And once you get used to it, you're going to wish you had more.
let me record you saying that.
Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah, but she's really taken this a great approach to this, and super, super smart lady that's doing cool stuff. So
yeah, definitely. So we hope you guys enjoy this podcast. We hope you get a lot out of it. And if you want to join her 14-day calorie challenge, you can use a code BTW5 for $5 off. So without further ado, here's Laura.
And we're live. Welcome to the podcast, Laura.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, congratulations on your Best of Paleo nomination.
You too. That's actually how I found out about you guys, because I was looking through the nominees just to see who have I not heard of, who do I need to connect with. So I'm really glad that somebody had actually emailed me and told me I was nominated. So I might not have even found out had they not.
It is a little funny, right? We didn't know either, except for someone, let us know, oh, by the way. And we were like, oh, I mean, we knew the nominations were up, but you just don't, you kind of just like, you think you get emailed or there's a process, but it's just like, no, it just happened.
Yeah, you could very well go through the entire thing without knowing anything about it. Like, you may even win. Like potentially you could win and not know if you weren't at Paleo Effects.
Yeah, exactly. And then you get all this influx of new business and you're like, where did you find out about me? Oh, because you won the best paleo podcast or whatever. So
yeah. Like, oh, of course. Yes.
Awesome.
I'm very proud of that. Yeah.
You're like, what did I win?
So Laura, with that said, maybe you can tell us what you were nominated the best of for, and you can tell us kind of let that be a gateway to telling us a little bit about your background.
Yeah, absolutely. So I was nominated for Best Paleo RD, which RD stands for Registered Dietitian. Ironically, I just think it's kind of a funny nomination because I would say in my business, I'm not like hardcore paleo or, I don't really identify as a paleo RD per se, just because some of the restrictions around paleo are not things that I necessarily recommend. And I tend to do more of like a high carb and high is probably the wrong term, just not low carb approach with a lot of my clients. So it just kind of makes me chuckle because I'm like, am I really paleo? I don't know. What is paleo these days? I feel like
paleo
right, exactly. Because I feel like when I first got into the paleo community back in, gosh, I want to say it was like 2011. I was really like hardcore like paleo advocate, just, really hardcore into it and just using that as my model for my nutrition blog and everything. And so I had gotten into paleo as a student in my RD program back in 2011. I'd been interested in nutrition for a while. My mother is actually a dietitian, and we were raised for most of our lives on more of a Weston Price style of eating. So none of this is like super new to me, but the paleo thing was something I discovered as almost an extension of Weston Price and CrossFit, basically. So I learned about that in 2010, 2011, and then I started my own blog, which at that time was called Ancestralize Me. And so I was in grad school. I ended up getting a job working for Chris Kresser, who most people probably know him. He's a pretty well-known paleo, I hate the word guru, but like, just like a figurehead, I guess we would call him. And so that really kind of catapulted me into the paleo and ancestral health world, working with him, writing my blog. Once I graduated from the program, I became an RD and I started my own private practice working one-on-one with individuals. And in the beginning, a lot of it was really paleo focused. I think I had a little bit of a different perspective on paleo coming from the Chris Kresser philosophy, just because he tends to be a little bit more nuanced about things than some of the more strict paleo recommendations. But basically I started there, and I would say, and I wouldn't say that I'm not interested in paleo, and I do a lot of work with clients that are on a strict paleo diet. I do clients that are on like an autoimmune level diet or keto, that kind of thing. So I'm not like anti-paleo. I've just discovered in the past 4 years of working with clients that a lot of times dietary restrictions that are arbitrary actually end up doing more harm than good. And so that's been an area where I feel like I've really locked in my business and my focus and my social media and my blog and everything, where optimizing your health sometimes requires flexibility in things like your diet, your exercise routine, because we all have choices to make. It's like we can't all do things perfectly. And one could argue that a super hardcore strict paleo diet isn't the healthiest diet for a lot of people. And so just learning how to balance people's social lives and their nutritional needs and their exercise choices, and how to pair the type of food you're eating with the type of exercise you're doing, all of that stuff really led me to a place where I don't really identify with any specific diet anymore when it comes to the work that I do, but I definitely come from more of like an ancestral health paleo-ish approach, and I help a lot of people with paleo diets to make sure that those are nutritionally appropriate for them. So that's kind of the way I got into the paleo world in general. And just in with my journey into health, again, coming from a background where I was taught these nutrition principles from the age of like 11 or 12 or something, it wasn't ever a situation where I had a really bad health issue that I solved with paleo or solved with real food or anything like that. I think for me, for a lot of my life, my goal with health and fitness was appearance based. And so once I kind of did some healing around body image and self-worth and all that fun stuff, I got to a place where nutrition and health was put into what I would consider an appropriate spot in my life, where it still supports my health, it supports my ability to live a fulfilling life, but it's not something I'm obsessed with or just making it the most important thing at all times.
There's so many things in there. I'm like, oh wait, I want to ask about this.
I'm sorry.
No,
I'm
it's
from
great.
New Jersey. You need to cut in if you want to talk.
No, it's great. I love it because this is what we want to know. We want to know your story. But the first thing I want to know is, actually, the first thing I want to mention to people out there listening to this is that we just forget that actually eating super healthy and being super healthy does make you look beautiful. So when people get confused about that, they're like, I don't care about diet and nutrition. I just want to be skinny or whatever. You're like, okay, but if you care about diet and nutrition, you're going to actually look the way you want to look if you just get that piece of it dialed in. But so I just wanted to drop that little pin for people out there. But the other thing I wanted to ask about you is you said you don't really necessarily suggest a paleo diet or, encourage a paleo diet if it's not best for the person. How do you decide what's in and what's out?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And when I say a paleo diet, what I'm referring to is the level of strictness in a paleo diet that would fully eliminate things like grains, dairy, legumes, that kind of thing, where I know a lot of people in the paleo community do practice somewhat of a 80-20 type of approach to paleo, which I actually think is really good. And so when I say that I don't do paleo, it just means that I'm not prescribing strict paleo to my clients in most cases. Again, there are some people that I do depending on what kind of health issues they have, but usually that's just a starting point.
Mm-hmm.
It's never going to be something where I'm like, you should never ever eat legumes for your entire life or something like that. So as far as how to figure that out, honestly, a lot of it comes down to what I had mentioned before about pairing food intake with exercise choices, for example. I personally don't see a lot of success I mostly work with women, younger women in kind of like the childbearing age range.
Mm-hmm.
And so I get a lot of women who go on like a kind of lower carb paleo diet and then combine that with high intensity exercise.
Mm-hmm.
And it works for a while, but then it ends up kind of not working anymore, or they end up gaining weight, or they don't feel good, or they develop hypothalamic amenorrhea, which is a missing period, or they just feel terrible all the time and they're exhausted. So I definitely kind of collect the clients who the low carb paleo thing didn't work for them, mostly because of the kind of training that they're doing.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not saying that doesn't work for people. I know there's probably thousands of people out there that it works great for, but I I'd get the ones that it didn't work for. So, so the overall macro balance tends to be something that for a strict paleo diet can be tough, especially if somebody does do better with higher carb. Also, certain foods like grains and legumes and dairy, there's a lot of people out there that don't need to be strictly avoiding those 100%. And for some people like myself, I actually do really well adding grains and legumes in. So I do things like rice and beans and occasional dairy. Like I don't drink milk, but I'll do yogurt or things, fermented dairy, that kind of thing. So I think for me, just personally, I like to have as little restrictions on my diet as possible from a mental health perspective. And then for my clients with a physical health perspective, my goal is always to get them on the least restrictive diet that will still support good health. And so paleo is a great place to start for a lot of people. And I'd say there's millions of people out there that probably should do a paleo reset or an elimination diet protocol to figure out where their gray area is. As I'm sure some people really can't touch gluten because it really hurts their bodies. It gives them bad gut symptoms, that kind of thing. And so, so for a lot of people, avoiding gluten definitely necessary. For some people like myself, I can have some gluten here and there and it really doesn't cause a problem. And it, to me, isn't worth the stress of trying to avoid it 100% of the time if there's no noticeable health problem from consuming it. So that's kind of how I work with clients, where I just want to help them get to a place where they feel mentally healthy around their diet, but then they also are eating in a way that supports their actual physical health. And there's a lot of nuance depending on the person there.
You should call it the nuance diet. Like fundamentally, that's really where we've wound up too over the years of doing paleo. And like you basically just described our approach to this whole thing, which is to kind of hit the low hanging fruit for folks and make sure that they're, not eating something that's toxic and like potentially, detrimental or firing up their immune system in some way. And then slowly but surely work their way towards the most inclusive diet possible. And it's so that's cool. Good. You're in good company.
Yeah, I think for me though, what I really want the listeners to get out of this is how they decide what's in or what's out for them. So like, what are some things that you would have people looking for that would say, okay, maybe gluten isn't good for you, or you seem to be fine with it. So what are some takeaways as a listener out there? You could go, oh yeah, that does happen to me when I eat this, or, some like something you can apply.
Yeah, that's a great question. So, to start, when I'm working with clients, what I do I do like a 90-minute case review when we're starting to work together, just so I can get a really deep dive into what they're dealing with, what their symptoms are. A lot of times clients will not even realize that something is actually a symptom. So it can really help to actually ask questions about that. But in general, we focus on what their primary symptoms are and track those symptoms as part of the process. So, digestive symptoms are probably one of the most common reactions that someone's going to get to a food that doesn't work well for them. So that can be things like bloating, diarrhea, constipation, reflux, just general gut pain. Any sort of digestive symptom after eating a food can be related to an intolerance. Now, it's not guaranteed because sometimes your gut just doesn't feel great, or maybe you picked up a stomach bug, or, there's a lot of different things that can affect our guts and how they function. Stress is a huge, trigger of IBS type symptoms for a lot of people. So just because you ate something and then had a gut symptom afterwards does not guarantee that the food was a problem, but it's definitely, if you're consistently getting a GI response to a food that's negative, it's a good thing to pull out for a while. Skin symptoms are another really common one. So things like acne, eczema, psoriasis, dry skin in general, rashes, that kind of thing. So acne can be tough because sometimes it can take a while for that symptom to go away, just because most people don't get a pimple within hours after eating something. But that's one that I like to track if somebody does have acne, because a lot of foods do actually trigger acne in certain people. So skin issues, fatigue and energy in general, again, kind of a tricky one because so many other things affect fatigue, and you can't necessarily say an immediate fatigue reaction is because the food caused a problem, but it's a symptom to look for. I would say my autoimmune clients, a lot of them will have joint pain if they're eating something. Again, not immediately, but if they eat gluten, maybe the next day they're more painful, or it takes them a couple days to recover from exercise, that kind of thing. So some of the symptoms can be a little bit more subtle. The GI symptoms definitely tend to be the most immediate, though. I mean, some people will eat something and in 10 minutes they'll be in the bathroom, and that's a pretty good sign. If that happens every time you eat something, that's not a good thing to eat. But it can be difficult to track progress and track symptoms. I think that's where the paleo reset can be really helpful, because you end up pulling out everything for 30 days and really getting a baseline to work from. And then once you establish that baseline, doing a more I guess, slow and steady reintroduction of specific foods and tracking symptoms, even though a lot of people see that as being super time consuming and mentally exhausting, which it is. It's still way better to go through that process and then know, okay, I can eat dairy, or I can eat butter, but maybe not cheese or something like that, and not have as much anxiety around food, because you have more control and you have more understanding of which foods actually are a problem. So that's kind of the overarching approach that I take. I would say there are certain symptoms that I see aligning with certain sensitivities a little bit more often. Like, I'm trying to think of an example. Like GI symptoms with dairy are pretty common because of lactose intolerance. Also, just for whatever reason, people tend to be a little bit more sensitive to dairy than maybe, say, I don't know, eggs or something like that. But there are some foods, if I see somebody's got a symptom that they haven't necessarily connected to a food, and I know they're eating gluten or dairy or eggs or something like that, that can trigger some symptoms, I'll say, let's pull that one out for a couple weeks and see how you do, because it might be causing a problem, it might not, but we'll never know until you take a break from it. So there are some patterns that I've seen symptom wise, but it's one of these things where it's like, I'm always learning new connections with things. And there's always a client that comes to me and says, oh, I discovered that if I eat eggs, like I have a headache an hour later, and it happens every single time I eat eggs. And it's not necessarily something that anyone else has ever had that I've worked with. But now that I know to look for that, I might suggest it to another client. So there's a lot of clinical experience that goes into the actual decision making.
So have you, and I know Chris Kresser has written somewhat critically about food sensitivity testing and just like its overall accuracy, but have you gotten involved in that at all, or with any of the, mail home kits like Everlywell or any of these companies that seem to be thriving?
I have not really done those kits, and honestly, I haven't done much research on them, so I can't say with any certain authority on whether or not they're accurate. I am a why am I blanking? Faculty member. Like, why am I blanking on a faculty member at the Kresser Institute? Myself and Kelsey Kinney both teach the nutrition and exposome part of the course, which exposome is just talking about nutrition, lifestyle, exercise, all the stuff that's not functional medicine based, essentially. And so in that program, I believe Chris has covered food sensitivity testing and kind of the pros and cons and the debunked style of testing. And the one test that I believe the Kresser Institute suggests as an option is the Cyrex panel, which even that is with a level of caveat that it's not going to pick up everything, and it can pick up false negatives. So, false positives. So it's one of these things where, honestly, I don't use them a whole lot because I don't, they're expensive, and I don't necessarily want somebody to spend hundreds of dollars on a test that may not be that accurate when we could do something a little bit more DIY, relying on my experience and their effort to track things. Normally that kind of testing isn't necessary. I would say it becomes necessary if somebody has tried every single type of food restriction and just has this nagging symptom that won't go away, and they've done all the different treatments, they've done all the different supplements, and nothing's helped. Then in that case, perhaps a food sensitivity test would be warranted. But the one, like I said, if they were going to do one, I feel most comfortable with the Cyrex panel. Otherwise, the ones that you mentioned about, like the mail home kits, I don't know enough about their accuracy to say whether or not they'd be useful.
Yeah. And this is one of the things that, everybody's trying to carve out their piece of this from a business perspective, but it's like there's so many of these things that they pop up and people are like, oh, I'm going to do this and that. And then they get all of this data and they're like, well, okay, this is more or less inconclusive,
Right.
and they wind up back at the process, which you did a great job of describing, where you go through thing by thing. You start with, likely some sort of relatively strict elimination diet, and you add things back in, and you, God forbid, just pay attention to what goes on,
how you feel,
how you feel for a period of time, and see what happens. And it's just really worth harping on for a second, because exactly like you said, it's a total pain in the ass. Nobody wants to spend this amount of time paying this close of attention and documenting every little thing that goes on, but it's your gateway to a less restrictive life for a period of time afterwards. Otherwise you're going to be beholden to a lot of dietary restrictions that aren't necessarily doing you any good, and potentially, as you mentioned, like just driving you bananas, or limiting your ability to act like a normal human in social environments.
Right. Yeah, it's kind of like a rock and a hard place where you either don't restrict anything and you feel like garbage, or you go too restrictive and then you live like a hermit because you can't eat outside of the house.
Right.
So I don't like people to be in either of those situations. My goal is always to get them to a place where, yeah, maybe they're not eating out every 2 nights or something, or they're not going to certain types of restaurants because they can't really find something there. But I think everyone should be able to eat outside of the house without a problem. And that the goal should be to eat a diet that doesn't require you to cook 100% of your own food.
So the gray area here that I want to touch on and ask you how you navigate this is, once you've gone through that elimination period, say people reintroduce gluten and they seem to be fine. Is there some kind of prescription you give them, or some kind of, structure you give them in terms of how they watch for whether or not it becomes not fine again? Because I know for me personally, it's like I can have gluten here and there. And I actually even think it's important because I don't want to be so intolerant to it that, like, if I get it in my diet, I can't deal with it, or I can't,
Or you like walk past a bakery and you break out in hives.
Exactly. And I
like
think,
that.
We see that in the paleo world, or we see that in this ancestral world, where people almost create a situation where they can't, accidentally come into contact with anything. So do you help clients, or how do you help them navigate that gray area of like how much is okay and what is too much?
Well, so one thing is that going through the process that we talked about is really helpful, because then they know what they're looking for as far as problems are concerned. So one thing that is usually a problem for a lot of people is that they're not even paying attention to how they feel, or they're just kind of like accepting that something's normal when it's not. And if they get to a point where they feel really good and they have a really good baseline of good health, that's when that experimentation can kind of ebb and flow, I would say. So you have times where you're being a little bit more prescriptive about it, where it's like, okay, have this food for 3 days and, have this much volume at each meal to test it out, to see how you feel, see how you react. And if there's no reaction to it and you say, okay, it seems like this is fine, I would say at that point, it's really an ongoing process. So just to give myself as an example, there will be periods of time where I'm eating certain foods and they're totally fine and they don't bother me at all. I think dairy is a great example of that for me personally. And then other times, I don't know if it's where I'm having the dairy or like the type of dairy it is, or maybe it's a combination of dairy plus stress or whatever. But sometimes I find that dairy just really wrecks my stomach. And so for me, the way that I approach it is that I know that there's very few foods that I would feel afraid to eat. If not, pretty much, I don't personally think there's anything that I would be afraid to eat. Maybe there's things I would prefer not to eat, but nothing really gives me any sort of fear or anxiety about food. And then there's certain foods that I really would rather not eat if I don't need to. So like gluten's a great example of something where I buy gluten-free food. I really am quite picky about the gluten that I consume. But I'd like to have wedding cake when I'm at a wedding, or I like to, if I'm at a restaurant that looks like it has amazing bread, I'll have a little bit of bread just to enjoy it. And so that's an example of a food where I know if I eat it all the time, my stomach doesn't do well, or I'll have like skin reactions, that kind of thing. But I feel like I've gotten to a point where those symptoms aren't really an issue. And so I feel like the amount I'm eating is good. But again, it's kind of like the thing with the dairy, where if I suddenly am feeling kind of junky and my stomach hurts and I'm just not feeling the way that I felt at baseline, I will reevaluate and think, okay, let me like rein it in a little bit and get rid of some of these things that kind of snuck in that probably aren't the healthiest and maybe aren't the most tolerable from a gut perspective, and then kind of work from there again. So that's what I'm talking about with that ebb and flow, where it's like, yeah, there's going to be some times where you're a little loose and maybe some symptoms start to come back. And then you're like, all right, let me tighten it up again and then get back to a baseline. And then I can kind of like pulse like that. So not a very prescriptive description, but that's the way I approach it in my own life.
Yeah, sorry. It's like basically how we do it too. So I'm like, you're basically telling our story. It's great.
Well, we're getting a lot of validation out of this conversation so far, which is great. But
you guys are doing a great job. My thumb is up. You can't see it, but it's up.
So, but this is, and I think it's something that's really important for folks to get, because I think there's, we tend to see a lot of people who have come out of some sort of a normal, like normal in air quotes, dieting structure, right? Where it's sort of like, okay, well, I'm going to eat super, super restrictive until I get to a goal weight usually. And that's going to involve a bunch of training. And then I'm going to come out of that and because the bikini day is over or whatever the thing was that they were training for. And so they're in this really sort of yo-yo pattern of eating, and whether it's, standard American diet or just even some, healthier whole grains and low fat yogurt version of that kind of thing. And then they come across paleo and they're like, oh, wait, this makes a lot of sense. And so we often pick up people who have this weird amalgamation of paleo strictness and then sort of normal dieting strategies for getting in and out of things. And what we get a lot is this idea that, okay, I went paleo. This is supposed to fix the problem, and this is actually one of the things that we have on our website somewhere. It's like, okay, well, you went paleo, now what? Because it's not just this prescriptive switch that you flip for most people that fixes this problem. And I think what you're just describing is this likely lifelong sort of self-reflection on what it is that you're eating and how your body's reacting to it and how you mold that in and out of your life to maintain whatever level of, this like balance of health and I don't know, like ability to just be in the average outside world. And so I think it's just important to highlight that even for the experts in this, like yourself, it's an ongoing adjustment, that fundamentally the skill required to be able to do this is that you can pay attention to what's going on in your body and cue in to the things that you put in it, the overall stresses, the environment around you, and then fundamentally how you feel. So this is, as much as would like to just say it's all going to be roses someday, it just got to get comfortable with the process, because this is what it looks like, right?
Right. And honestly, just from like a personal kind of mental health, spiritual health, all that non-physical health perspective, I do think sometimes people need to look beyond the like minutia of their physical health to also look at their just overall quality of life. I find that a lot of people will end up getting so wrapped up in just tinkering and tweaking and like, everything's got to be perfect and I'm going to be constantly thinking about it and optimizing it. And I just feel like it gets to a point where it's like, all right, but then also you have to live your life and you have to like go have fun with your friends and you have to like sleep and you have to do productive things and, find your purpose and all that fun stuff. And it's like, I think trying to maintain the balance between not just saying screw it and I'm just going to eat whatever and not care, and it doesn't matter if my stomach hurts all the time or if I, have horrible skin problems or anything like that. Like I don't want people to not feel well, but I think people have to get to a point where good enough is good enough, and then they can kind of focus on other things. And that's kind of how I approach my diet, where it's like, all right, if I'm not feeling great, maybe I'll kind of reassess and say, okay, what am I doing? What have I been a little loose on lately? Let me like tighten it up a little bit. But it doesn't turn into this like, I don't want people to think that it has to be this ongoing mental effort, that they're just always paying attention. They're always like just on it all the time. Because again, I think people can get a little bit over focused on diet and exercise and all the really really obvious things that can affect our health, and they miss things like stress and social connection and spiritual health and all these things that I think are just as important, but are a lot more, they just don't have as much concrete behavior change around them. And it's not as easy to figure out, like, why do I feel lonely, or what, why do I feel unfulfilled in my job? That kind of thing.
Well, it's interesting. I actually have a theory about this, because you see folks who get really focused on their diet, and it starts to minimize what they are allow in their social life. And you see people actually making decisions about what they'll go do in their life based on whether or not their food situation will be okay. And I actually believe that oftentimes people have social anxiety, or they have things around being social, and they use the diet as sort of a crutch or a reason to withdraw from community, which is probably the one thing they really need in order to get through their social anxiety, or to work through that piece of it. But I think people really get attached to using this diet thing as a tool, and it's a good one, because people can't battle you on it or argue with you about it. It's like, oh, I can't do that because that that food will make me sick. The person has to accept that answer, like, oh, okay.
Right.
But I really do see this a lot, and I see it not just in the paleo community, but in any veganism or whatever. You can see people use this diet or this strictness as a way to kind of pole position what's going on for them emotionally, and use it sort of as a tool to buffer them from whatever they don't want to deal with. And it's a pretty big statement, but after years of coaching, I'm sure you've probably seen this in your world, where people just get really addicted to this story about how their nutrition and how their diet, how the buffer that it creates between them and normalcy. And so I think it's something that people just have to consider, like, what role is my diet playing in my life right now? And I think you said it perfectly. Like, you have to consider the stress, or the community, or the social connection. And you can't just keep making your life smaller and smaller for your diet. The goal is to actually create a healthy ecosystem. And I'm always telling people, don't forget to heal. Like the point is to heal and get back out there, get back in the game, So.
Right. And it's funny, because I feel like on the other side of that coin is people who create community around their fitness, for example, which I think is great in theory. And I think in practice, it does work really well for some people. But I also tend to work with the overachieving type A women who they get overtrained very easily, or they just push themselves too hard. And then when you tell them they have to take a break from CrossFit or powerlifting or whatever that they're doing, they're like, but those are my friends. Like, what am I going to do? I have no stress relief, or I have no social life if I don't go to CrossFit. And so again, I think fitness communities are awesome. And it's really nice to be able to have that community be built and not just be working out like, on a treadmill, like not interacting with anybody.
Right.
But it can become a little dangerous if somebody needs to make a change to their health habits, if they feel like they've now identified themselves as, oh, I'm a CrossFitter, or, oh, I'm paleo and all my friends are paleo. And, if I want to go have like rice at sushi, somebody's going to tell me how rice is going to give me cancer or something. It's one of these things where I think it can either isolate you, or it can become your identity to the point where you can't make changes when it actually would make sense from a health perspective.
It's so funny, because this is, a large part of where our drive to start our company and sort of model it came from was the community that we found at CrossFit, because we trained with Rob Wolf back before it was CrossFit days, and
back in the Paleolithic era.
Exactly. Back in the Paleolithic, the pre-Paleo era. But it was such an incredible experience for us, because that sense of community and the kind of workouts and the stuff that we were doing, and there was at that time, there was like a mystique to the whole thing, because there were no books about this. This was just some crazy dude that, that didn't wear shoes telling us that we should not be eating grains and should be eating, a higher fat meal and an occasional sweet potato if you really earned it, it was kind of the deal. But that community that we found there was incredible. Yet it's funny when you talk about like being concerned about somebody seeing you eating sushi. This was a relatively small town
Yeah.
and Chico, and there was like a legitimate concern amongst some of us on like the games, because we all competed at the games, and like on the games team, like we were all nervous to go shopping because, oh man, what if we run into Rob and Nikki at the grocery store
Yeah.
and they see that we've got like
Mhm.
a 6-pack of beer or a frozen
Ice
pizza, like,
cream.
oh my
Yeah.
god,
We're like,
there's like
Yeah.
anyway, so it's real, like that anxiety is real,
Right. And it's funny because you guys are laughing about it, which I think it's hilarious as well. But then you think about how many people would think that and then they'd be afraid to buy the beer
Yeah.
because they were like, what are they gonna think of me?
Yeah.
I mean, and this is like such another topic, but just the fear around social isolation and rejection from your community is so strong in humans that anything that someone thinks is going to jeopardize their relationships with their friends or anything like that, they're afraid to really do what they need to do
Mhm.
for their own sakes. And so so sometimes that can become a problem in the health conscious community because it's like they get used to doing it a certain way and they get into this community that does it that way, and then they stop listening to their own body and they stop listening to their needs. And it's just funny because I feel like our community is so different than the rest of the country as far as like what problems we run into, because I primarily work with people who are very health conscious, very highly educated, very motivated. It's rare for me to work with someone who isn't spending hours on podcasts or reading books, that kind of thing. But it's almost, they get to the point where they're so information saturated and so indoctrinated into the community that they're in that they just like they don't know how to reevaluate what they're doing, and they don't know where they should even start because they've been told so many things and they have so much riding on their compliance to that lifestyle that it's like it's almost like afraid to even try to change because they don't know what's going to happen.
Right.
And so it's really crazy because it's like I feel like this is a very unusual time in human history where it's like your choices around food and fitness and all that make such an important impact on your social life and your community and your identity. But it is something that I really try to help my clients kind of remove themselves from and not have their identity come from what they're eating or how they're exercising or like what their health habits are, because it's just, I don't think it's necessary to live a healthy life, and I think it can really be damaging if that becomes just overpowering for the rest of their lives.
For sure. Well, the paleo story is super compelling, and I think that's part of like where we see people get hung up in it, because even amongst our own clients, who we're just as open with as possible about our own personal journeys and kind of where we've come to with this stuff. But then you bring rice up and they're just like, oh man, I don't know, I just don't know if I can do the rice, like it's heroin, you know what I mean? And it's like, if I go back on the smack, I'm just not sure I'm going to be able to get off of it.
Can't trust myself.
Just can't trust myself with this stuff. But I just think it's a super interesting deal, because it's like the I don't know, the way that I've been thinking about it kind of recently, like why paleo can be so compelling for folks, is because it gives them empowerment around a restrictive diet. So you don't usually hear people who are like into the paleo diet saying, oh, I'm on this diet and I can't eat grains, legumes, and dairy. They almost always say, I don't. And that's a very different thing. Like, no, I don't eat those things because they're not good for me, as opposed to I can't eat those things because somebody told me that I can't, And so I think that it's really like, for some people who, especially if they've been in this sort of normal dieting sphere where they've been told what they can't eat, it can be incredibly empowering and somewhat addictive to be in the driver's seat for once, saying, I don't do this, I choose not to do this, because there's this compelling story that I've been reading about that makes sense as to why I wouldn't. And so I think like it's a challenge to reevaluate that story, because you're still having to try to fit. So let's say now you're like, hey, okay, I've done this restrictive piece of this thing, and now let's branch out and see what kind of foods I can tolerate. And I'm hearing all these stories about safe starches and all of this stuff, so let's see what's going on over here. But then how do I fit that into a narrative where I still am being the one who's who has the power, who's making the decision to do this, that, or the other thing? And if people can get around that, and just sort of recognize that it is fundamentally their decision to do like whatever it is that they want to do, and that if they put the appropriate sort of intention into how they're going about this, you can maintain the control aspect, or like the pieces of that story that feel good, and still be able to move the needle. I don't know.
And it's funny because just the way you're describing that makes me think of a conversation I've had with many clients that as much as we know about nutrition and what food is healthy, what food is not healthy, I think nutrition science is still pretty new. And even if we have pretty good ideas of what people should be eating, I don't think anyone can say with extreme certainty about anything that's like real food. I mean, if we're talking about things like trans fats, I think we're pretty confident about those not being good for us, but things like meat or saturated fat or sugar even, because sugar obviously is natural in fruit and honey and that kind of thing. So there's parts of our diet where you can pretty much find anyone that has evidence to support that whatever you're eating is going to kill you. And so because the evidence is somewhat mixed and not very conclusive, and it's really theoretical in a lot of ways at this point, the idea that we could ever know for sure what the perfect diet is, I think is just not correct. And so when you have people who believe that at some point they will be able to discover the perfect diet that will never cause them disease or will make them live to 150 or whatever their goal is, if they realize that that's not possible, I think it takes a lot of the pressure off them to be perfect. Because at the end of the day, there's things that we don't know about food. There's things that we don't understand how foods interact, where it's, maybe there is evidence that red meat causes cancer, but maybe it's because that meat is, CAFO meat, or it's because the person's not eating vegetables, or, there's just so many things that we'll probably never know with 100% certainty because you can't do the kind of research on humans that you would need to do. And I think sometimes people need to, they need to be educated because there's a lot of just bad information out there. But then they also need to realize that even the best information is still just theory. And I try to make sure my clients know that what I'm teaching them is based on the best knowledge that I have, but I could be wrong about certain things. And there could be things that we discover in 10 or 20 years that then would make me change my mind about what I'm recommending. But it just, I don't want anyone to ever think that they could find this like holy grail perfect diet where nothing they eat is causing problems and everything is perfectly healthy. Cause it's just, I just don't think it exists. And I think the desire to get there is somewhat problematic.
This is a super exciting conversation. I really love it because I think that, obviously we're in the paleo world and we definitely relate to it. And it's definitely a place that we encourage people to go in the beginning of their journey. But I think so many people get stuck, and this is so good. I think more and more people within this community are starting to say these things and giving people permission to reevaluate and, really decide for themselves what's working and what's not, instead of being stuck in something that essentially is a jumping off point, really the paleo diet is a jumping off point in its strictest form. It's a place to start when you're not sure what's going on or what's causing the issues. It's a great way to get, or maybe even AIP if you want to take it one step further, but it's like people get stuck in those spaces. And I think that ultimately it's also reflective of how we get stuck just as humans. We forget to keep growing, keep changing, keep moving forward. And especially as we get older, we just get a little bit more stubborn, a little more set in our ways. And we, let how we are, our identity right now take the grips of us, and we forget to keep growing and keep moving forward. And I think it's really exciting just to be having this conversation more frequently in this community. So thank you for having this with us.
Oh, absolutely. And that actually made me think of one of the major issues I see in a lot of my clients, where you were mentioning getting stuck, kind of like thinking about what used to work, for example. And I work with a lot of women especially, but I do have some men where maybe they're in their 30s or 40s, and what they were doing when they were 20 or 25 just isn't working for them anymore. And they keep trying to hammer it harder, basically. Oh, well, I'm just not doing enough. Or and so maybe there's a woman that wants to lose weight, and when she was 25, she did the Atkins diet, and she lost 20 pounds in a month, and it was super easy. And she's like, oh, now that I've gained a little bit of weight, I'll just do that again and it'll work.
Right.
And then she does it and it doesn't work, or maybe she gains weight doing it. And then she's like, well, what the heck? It worked when I was 25. Why isn't it working when I'm 40 or whatever?
Yes.
And so instead of being like, well, what's changed? What's different about my body? Like, did that original weight loss actually cause some problems with my metabolism because I lost weight too fast? Or like, did I have like disordered eating that then makes it harder for me to lose weight? Those kind of questions where a lot of times people think, well, it worked for me before, so why isn't it working now? I just think people can get really trapped in their previous experience. And what I was saying before about carbs being a great example of that is where, and again, I tend to collect the low carb failure type clients. So I'm not saying that low carb doesn't work for some people.
Right.
I always like to say that caveat because I hate for people to think that I'm just this like anti-low carb person. But I get a lot of clients who they did low carb or keto or something like that, and it worked great for a couple months. But then, 6 months later, they are exhausted. They're bonking at their workouts. They're losing muscle mass. They're not sleeping well. Like all this crap is hitting the fan essentially. And they just refuse to see it as a diet issue because they're like, well, when I first did low carb, it felt amazing. And I was like crazy energized and I was never hungry and I hardly had to eat anything because I was running on adrenaline and that kind of thing. And so I just think it's really important to not let past experience dictate what you're doing currently, because first of all, it could have just been that time of your life that you were more tolerant. I know for me, I used to go out drinking until 3:00 in the morning when I was 22 or something. And if I tried to do that now, I would be in bed for 5 days afterwards. So first of all, just remembering that what worked for you when you were younger is not necessarily going to work for you now. And then also realizing that sometimes the initial results that you get from some of these really restrictive diets isn't actually something that's healthy, because our bodies, when we get into like a starvation mode type of situation, it switches on that stress response that's going to actually trigger you to feel better in the short term, but eventually lead to you feeling pretty crappy down the road. So I just like people to remember that just because something worked for you a year ago or 2 years ago, or that you were tolerating it when you were 25, your body may be different now, or maybe it just wasn't something that was actually helping in the long term. So you don't want to just get stuck in this mindset that, well, it worked for me before, so it's got to work for me now. And maybe I just need to go lower carb because maybe my 10 grams of carbs per day is too much for my body to handle.
I looked at some carbs today. I have to stop looking at them.
So I think this may have been like a perfect little segue into just jumping into some of the HPA axis. Which is, so is this one of these things like SWAT, which is Special Weapons and Tactics Team, right? So there's like SWAT team. Is HPA axis? Is axis the A?
No. So actually HPA stands for hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. So yeah, we kept the A separate on that one. So I do a lot of work in what's affectionately termed adrenal fatigue, but if you ask a doctor, they will probably slap you in the face if you call it adrenal fatigue. So I like to educate people about what it actually is, so that way they can speak about it with some scientific literacy. So the HPA axis is essentially the communication between your brain and your adrenal glands, which are the glands that do most of the stress management hormone release in your body. They do some other things like blood sugar, blood pressure, that kind of stuff, which, to be fair, is part of the stress response. But they also do produce some sex hormones. And I think there's probably a lot of things that they do that are not directly related to stress, but we tend to think about them as like the stress organs. And so your brain is where you're going to be perceiving stress. So your brain is part of the stress response. And it's a very important part of the stress response, because one of the reasons why people don't like the term adrenal fatigue is that it insinuates that your adrenal glands aren't functioning normally, or that they're wearing out and that they can't produce cortisol. I would say 90 to 95% of the time, it has nothing to do with the function of the adrenal glands, unless somebody has Addison's disease, which is an autoimmune attack on the adrenal glands. Most of the time, it's a brain issue where the brain is telling the adrenal glands to change how it's reacting to stress. It's either telling it to pump out more cortisol, or it's telling them to just stop producing cortisol because there's too much cortisol in the system. The brain is really in control of all of our hormone production at the root. So anything that's going on with either cortisol or sex hormone balances, anything like that, you have to be looking at how the brain is involved. And for a lot of my clients, ultimately, the decisions they're making about their diet and their exercise and their sleep and all their lifestyle habits are essentially telling their brain that there is serious stress going on and that they either need to crank out the cortisol to help them survive that stress, or if it's been going on long enough, cortisol can be toxic to the brain over the long term. The brain actually wants to protect itself and then really reduce cortisol production. So if somebody's experiencing symptoms of what, like I said, is normally called adrenal fatigue, you have to look at what is the brain actually telling the adrenal glands to do? Why is it telling the adrenal glands to not produce cortisol? Or why is it telling it to crank out the cortisol? And really looking at what are the choices that that person's making in their current diet and lifestyle that would be telling the brain that there is danger and that there is stress. So that's kind of the very like nutshell version of how the HPA axis is involved in health. I'm sure a lot of people are familiar with the term adrenal fatigue. They're familiar with the kind of symptoms that can come from the adrenal fatigue syndrome, but it's something that I see a lot of health conscious people developing those kind of symptoms because their diet is too restrictive, because they're accidentally undereating, because they're either accidentally or purposefully overtraining, because they're not prioritizing social life or community or, positive emotions or, dealing with trauma that they've been through in the past. And there's so many different things that tell our brain if we're safe or not. And when I work with any clients that have HPA axis dysregulation, or if anyone goes through our online program that we have called Paleo Rehab, essentially we're really just looking at all the major factors that they have control over and trying to make them as low stress as possible. And for a lot of people, stress is caused by a calorie imbalance. So they're training hard, they're very active, but they're eating 1,500 calories a day. And that's one of the bigger stressors that we can put our bodies under, since obviously starvation is a pretty dangerous state to be in. And so if somebody's under eating chronically or exercising excessively for their diet intake, that's a really, really common way for someone to develop that type of adrenal fatigue syndrome, even if they're doing, a quote unquote healthy diet and they're active and they're trying to take care of themselves properly.
This makes, you just hear so many of the same sort of, what's the word I'm looking for? Like the same stories, over and over. Themes. Thank you. That's it. I was like, the stories, the same themes, and all of these topics that we talk about. And I think it's like, if people really start listening, they can really start to hear like, oh, I do that, or, oh, I can change my reality. I can change my physicalness by changing my relationship to how I look at my food and exercise. And I think that's what I keep pulling out of this conversation is just, I'm hoping folks are hearing like the relationship you have to your life is the most important one that you have. And, it's not about this tunnel vision of what am I eating and how am I exercising to create the perfect outcome. It's about the relationship of it all, like how your balance, how your homeostasis of your life works out. And I think I'm hoping that people really get that. And that's what, like, you're doing such a great job of painting that picture. So with that in mind, I want you to talk about the program you have for the making sure that people are not under eating, or helping people to understand the amount of calories that's appropriate for them.
Yeah, sure. So it's sort of a shorter intro to the kind of work that myself and my colleague Kelsey Kinney do in this like under eating field. We were inspired to create this ebook because in our Paleo Rehab program, which is the one that's really heavily focused on adrenal fatigue and HPA axis dysregulation, something that we kept finding with so many of our clients, and actually I should throw in, I have another program called Get Your Period Back that kind of has a similar theme coming up for it, where a lot of people are getting positive results because of the diet changes that lead them to eat more, which it seems so just simple and obviously kind of like counterintuitive, because most people would say, well, most people are sick because they eat too much. So in our community, a lot of sickness and health problems are actually coming from inadequate food intake.
Mm-hmm.
And so we were finding in the Paleo Rehab adrenal fatigue program, and I'm finding in my Get Your Period Back program, and Kelsey and I both find this in our day-to-day private clients as well, that if somebody's under eating, basically you can't fix anything in their health until they're eating enough. And so that's a huge linchpin in somebody's health progress. If they're, like I said, I work with women who are eating like 1,000 calories a day or 1,200 calories a day, and it's not on purpose. It's not that they're like trying to diet. It's just that they are not eating calorie dense foods, and they have this, social programming to eat less and to be smaller and to, not eat as much as their husbands do, or whatever the kind of like mental barriers that they have about eating enough are for them. It's kind of insane how many people I work with that just fixing their food intake from a calories perspective is enough to get them feeling like 50 to 80% better or to solve certain health problems.
Wow.
So it's something that Kelsey and I, we used to have a podcast, and we were talking about it a lot, and we talk about it a lot with our clients on the blog. And we were just like, we need to create some kind of like easily accessible product for people that they can actually experience this transformation that our clients get to experience just from eating more. And so we came up with this concept called the 14-day Calorie Challenge. And essentially it's a challenge for someone to eat an appropriate amount of calories for 2 weeks and see what happens to their health. Because like I said, it's really kind of crazy. Things that we've seen where someone thought that maybe, let's say they thought that they couldn't tolerate carbohydrates because anytime they ate sugar or, fruit or rice or anything, they had this like massive blood sugar spike and drop. And what it turns out is that the reason that they're not tolerating rice or fruit is because their bodies are so nutritionally deprived that when they actually get the carbs into their system, they just can't even appropriately respond to the insulin and the carb bolus and all that. So they end up overreacting to the carbs that they've eaten. Or, if they're under eating, they have a ton of cortisol running around in their system, so they can't actually be as insulin sensitive as they would be if their food intake was appropriate. So there's so many things that people, if somebody had that experience, they might think, oh, I just can't tolerate rice, or I can't eat fruit because my blood sugar goes crazy when I eat that kind of stuff. And like I said, that's a great example of a person where you get them eating enough and then they can tolerate all these foods that they couldn't tolerate before. And they're just like, I have no idea that was a problem. So that's kind of the concept of this challenge. And so, one thing that makes it really hard for people to eat enough is if they have specific health issues like IBS or autoimmune disease, or, they have celiac disease, so they can't touch gluten at all, or they have a dairy allergy, just any limitation that's legitimate, which again, as we said before, there are definitely people out there that cannot eat certain foods, and it's definitely a health related issue, and they should just never eat them at all. And so if you have these required food restrictions, it really just it makes it harder to eat enough because you can't eat things that are available in normal life. Or, you're at the airport and you're like, I can't find something gluten-free, so I'm just going to skip my food. Right. Or, they can't figure out a quick breakfast because they don't want to do granola bars or muffins or something. So they don't have time to cook eggs. They just skip breakfast. And so it's one of these things where if somebody has food restrictions, the likelihood of them under eating even goes higher because it's just hard for them to eat enough. Right. So what we did with this ebook is we created 5 different meal plans that we were hoping would cover a pretty big component of that population. So all of the meal plans are gluten-free. We have a strict paleo one that is based on the rules around paleo, like, no dairy, no gluten, no grains, no peanuts, that kind of thing. We have an autoimmune paleo version, which autoimmune paleo tends to be one of the more restrictive diets out there. And we have a lot of clients on that diet that really struggle to get enough calories in. So that was a really important one for us to create, because it's like eating that diet is really hard. Even if you're just trying to get enough carbs on that diet, it can be tough. And then we have a digestive health version of the ebook, which is a low FODMAP diet. And a FODMAP is basically just a fermentable carbohydrate that dysbiosis in the gut can feed on. So a lot of people with IBS and various types of, constipation, diarrhea, that kind of thing tend to be sensitive to FODMAPs. So we did create a digestively focused meal plan that removes FODMAPs. So our goal with this program, and again, program is almost a strong word. It's just an ebook that has a shopping guide and recipes and an exact meal plan to follow for 2 weeks to make sure you're getting enough food. It also has a calorie calculator to help you estimate what your needs are, and you can kind of tailor the meal plan to meet those needs. We really created this because, again, we just saw so many people struggling with adrenal fatigue type symptoms, hormonal symptoms, really, not tolerating workouts very well, not sleeping well at night. That's a huge one that happens when people are under eating. Just so many of these symptoms that people have no idea have to do with their inadequate food intake, and they don't realize it until they've actually experienced what it feels like to eat enough. So that was really our desire with this ebook, is to create a starting point for people who really need to experience what adequate food intake feels like. And once they get a sense for not only how their health changes, but also what that amount of food looks like on their plate, they can then start to eat in a way that actually provides enough calories for them on a daily basis. So that was kind of our goal with this project, because it was honestly just shocking how many people we work with that the under eating piece is like 80-90% of their health problems.
It's a huge one. And, and the thing that gets that, because we see a very similar thing. And I mean, and I work with a lot of men who are having difficulty maintaining muscle mass, and there's all of this kind of stuff going on. And as soon as we start to approach some of the nutritional strategies, they're like, well, this is way too much food. This is probably twice as much food as I was eating. I'm like, well, there you go, and part of the deal is if you're eating low carb, it probably means you're eating high fat and relatively high protein, super satiating, and you're trying to get your 18-hour, intermittent fast in there. Like, no, you just can't jam 3,500 calories into that window eating those kind of foods. And so you taper off, and they're like, well, I'm not hungry. I don't feel like it. And you're like, yeah, well, you're also, not super happy, and your workouts suck, and your muscle mass is just going away. It's like, clearly we need to change something about this, So that's I guess point being, it's a male problem too. And especially in the paleo ancestral world, because you get so much agreement around things like intermittent fasting and these extended windows. And it's tough, man. It's really, really tough to do it right, to eat low carb, high fat, intermittent fast, and enough calories all at once that's a job, it's more of a job than I think people are up to in a lot of cases.
Yeah, I think if somebody wanted to torture me, they would put me on a intermittent fasting keto diet, because
well, it's funny you say that, because this is what you see happen a lot of times especially with women who do the paleo thing, have good success. They drop some weight in the beginning. They, they feel like, oh, wow, this low carb thing is working. And then, like you mentioned earlier, sometimes they'll backslide or it doesn't work. And so they try it harder, which ends up being keto. And then, now they're 6 months down the road of trying to be keto, and it's not helping. It's not creating the aesthetic or the health or the whatever they're after. And I think this is where people that are in that basket, and then you say, oh, guess what? Now we actually want to turn you all the way around and make you eat a lot. And it's, eat carbs, eat whatever. They're like so freaked out, because it's so, opposite of what they've been buying into for the last year or 6 months or however long. And I think this is why, for us, the keto thing is like, we just get, we don't super encourage it. If people want to, try it or whatever, but Adam and I are just kind of like, I don't know. It just seems like it goes wrong a lot.
Yeah. And you know what? One of the more frustrating things for me, and again, I've put clients on keto before. So, and I keep saying that caveat, but I'm just like waiting for the trolls to come find me and be like, stop bashing keto.
I know.
But it's funny. I feel like, it's not really funny, actually. The whole like weight loss as a sign of a diet success is something that really pisses me off, because not that weight loss is a bad thing to work towards. And I'm not saying that people shouldn't want to lose weight, or that if you're losing weight on a diet, it means it's a bad diet or anything like that. But the problem is that people will look at weight loss they'll weight it so heavily as far as like whether a diet's appropriate or not. And so somebody could be feeling like garbage. Their body temperature could be really low. They could be hardly functioning at their workouts. They could be sleeping like crap. And it's like all of these really objective measurements of health are terrible. But then they lost 20 pounds on the diet. So it's obviously a good diet. And then when you try to switch them on to a higher calorie, more carb dense diet and they gain 5 pounds, they freak out and they're like, well, I'm gaining weight. This can't be right. And it's just like, I just get really just angry that we've been told that weight is the most important gauge of some diet's healthfulness. And so
and weight loss now, people want it now. They want it the first week. Like, no, if you put me on a diet and I follow it, the sign that this diet is successful is that in the first week I lost 5 pounds. That's what people want. And you're like, no. Actually, the sign that it's successful is like a year from now when you eat something that you don't normally eat, you don't gain 5 pounds.
Yeah, it's kind of like the training side of the equation. Like, you know, people, I post a lot of my workouts to Instagram just as like a inspirational / like educational thing. Cause I work with a trainer. So I'm like, well, if it's working for me, if you look at what I'm doing, you could try doing it too. Right. But it's funny because I think people with training, they either want to feel like the workout's killing them and they're on the floor in a puddle of sweat, like minutes away from dying, or they want it to be something that they see fat loss really fast from. And it's funny because the way that I've been training with my coach for, it's, I guess, getting close to 3 years at this point, it took me probably 8 months before I actually saw much weight loss because of all the muscle I was putting on. But then for me, the weight kind of just like came off all of a sudden after 8 months of training. So it's one of these things where it's like, if most people expected to see amazing results after a month or even 3 months or 4 months or 6 months, they might kind of get to this point where they're like, this isn't working. So that's why I think, and it sounds like we're all on the same page here, where we're trying to promote sustainable, healthy changes that then allow your body to normalize at a healthy weight. Maybe it's not as lean as you would like to look, or you're not going to get any Sports Illustrated people calling you or anything like that, but it is something that's sustainable. You have some flexibility. Like you said, you can eat out or eat a lot of food and not gain 5 pounds the next day because your body can handle it. And it's just, I feel like getting to that point of like stability, and you can keep making progress, but you're not necessarily just on this like hair trigger where if you go off your plan for a minute, it's going to just like totally wipe out any progress that you made. And so it's not the sexiest thing to market to people, but it's like, I just think the benefit of getting to the point where your body's running really well, you feel really good, you're able to do what you're doing without a lot of stress or, you know, massive loss of quality of life because you can't socialize or anything like that. Right. It's not necessarily going to show you 20 pounds of weight loss in the first month, but over time, I think it's just worth the effort and worth the investment to get to a point where it's just kind of cruising, if that makes sense. Right. Where you're like, everything's going really well.
Totally. Well, and resiliency, you know what I mean? And this is something that, like, I mean, we certainly put some thought into resilience, like training specifically for resilience and the physical side of things, right? You want to be able to be forced into a range of motion. You know, let's say you're on a hike somewhere and you slip and fall, and now guess what? You're in a single leg deep squat. You know, if you've never been in that position before, then, you know, the odds of getting injured go up, right? And not that you necessarily want to train that position all the time, but you need to be familiar with all of these corners of your body, you know? And I think that a similar thing happens from a nutritional perspective. It's like we need to be resilient. That's where the ability to really go out and enjoy this life starts to show up, is if you can go out and go on a vacation and not worry about the slip on the canyon wall or whatever, and also not worry about, you know, what's in the super amazing local food that they made. You saw some corn floating around, there might be some in there. Is it going to be detrimental to your health? And it's the thing that's tricky is exactly like you said, it's not sexy to market. Like, this is the super resilient diet. You know what I mean? Like, you can go out and travel in third world countries and not get sick. Like, how do you know, you don't,
I think we're going to create something called the nuanced diet for super resilience.
There you go.
Perfect. It's perfect.
It's like, that's a mouthful.
It is, but you know what? There'd be like 5 or 6 people that'd be like, oh my God, that's precisely what I was
That's
looking
exactly
for.
what I needed.
If I don't lose weight in the 6 days of this, I don't know what will,
This is so cool. No, I love it. And I just want listeners out there, because the way that these podcasts are rolling out, we've had Diana Rogers, we've had Jason Tsai, we've had you. It's like, I just want people just like notice what everyone's saying. Get healthy, get healthy. Like that's what's up. Find your health and find that first, and like let the rest of it fall into place, because everyone gets so tunnel vision on weight loss and, the way that they look. And I think that, what you're saying is exactly right. It's just, it's like putting the cart before the horse. You just have to take that time to figure out what's going to be your perfect, balance and your perfect diet for you to thrive.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's one of these things where I think the paleo community is coming full circle on that kind of stuff. And
I agree.
It's a lot of really awesome people in the community that are just making that message part of like their daily announcements on social media or in their books or whatever. And yes. I really hope it'll sink in with the people that are listening today, because I just, knowing from my own experience what it used to be like when I was like super strict, trying to do low carb, paleo, like CrossFit. And again, none of these things are bad, but for me, they weren't good fits. And, just that mentality that this is the way to do it and there's no other options. It can be really discouraging when it's not working for you. And then you start to blame your body as opposed to thinking, well, maybe this just isn't the right combination of inputs for me. So I feel like if you're just willing to, kind of step back and look at what you're doing and say, is this really working for me? And if not, what are my options? What should I try? Certainly working with someone is a really good idea in that case, because it can be really difficult to be objective about your own experience or your own decision making there. And so getting a coach or working with a nutritionist can help you make those decisions in a way that's more clinically or evidence-based, I should say. But just really not ever getting to a place where you feel like you can't do what's best for you. And for a lot of people, what's best for them is to take a break from thinking about food for a bit.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And, kind of circling all the way back to the beginning of this is paleo. So I feel like what you're talking about, and, you were saying how it's funny to get nominated for a best of paleo, but this is my paleo. Like, this is what I consider paleo, or these conversations and this just sort of trend towards finding the best fit for what's going to give us a healthy life. So I do think you're paleo.
Oh, thanks.
At least in my mind, this is what paleo is.
The best compliment I've had all day.
All right. Perfect. So where can folks find you, Laura?
Sure. So I'd say my home base is my website, which is lauraschoenfeldrd.com. I'm also pretty active on Instagram, not quite as much active on Facebook, just because Facebook algorithm is awful. And I don't have thousands of dollars to spend trying to get people to see my post there. So I do a lot more on Instagram. But my website is where a lot of my blog posts and just where I kind of put my manifestos about these kind of things. So that's the best place to start for learning a little bit more about what I teach and what my philosophy is on health.
Awesome. And we'll have a special code for the Calorie Challenge in the show notes. So make sure you check those out, folks. And it's been an awesome conversation. So thank you so much for your time today, Laura.
Yeah. Thank you so much for having me.
All right. We'll see you soon.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Hey, folks, we hope you enjoyed this podcast. If you did, please consider going to iTunes and leaving us a 5-star review and, write in a nice message there. Tell us what you think. Tell us what's going on for you out there. We'd love to hear from you guys.
Specifically, how awesome we are.
But we do love connecting, and it's nice to know there's folks out there listening, enjoying, and this is a great way to just stay in communication. So if you enjoy the podcast, you listen regularly, you're getting some benefit out of this, we would so love to see that 5-star review. And give us a shout out. We'd love to hear from you.